Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Christian, and good evening. Thanks for coming. I had the idea earlier on in the conversation to start this by using a quote I like very much, which I used in my PhD, which was about another kind of precarious workers in South Africa, forestry workers. It's a quote by Studs Terkel. He was a journalist who in 1970s America traveled for several years and interviewed hundreds of people who worked. Bank workers, plumbers, prostitutes, all kinds of workers, and published, I think, a remarkable collection of portraits. And he wrote the following in his introduction. This book, being about work, is by its very nature about violence, to the spirit as well as to the body. It is about ulcers as well as accidents, about shouting matches as well as fistfights, about nervous breakdowns as well as kicking the dog around. It is above all, or beneath all, about daily humiliations. To survive the day is triumph enough for the walking wounded among the great many of us. Now, many foreigners like me, who come from a labor research or labor activist background and have benefited from the generous support of German foundations to do this kind of work in the global south and elsewhere, and have worked closely with German colleagues, have usually take some convincing to believe that working conditions in German universities are as precarious as they are, right? It makes me wonder if like the perennial shoemaker, our Germany-based colleagues have the worst shoes. They are a country that's perhaps one of the only ones that's ready to give out money to support unionization in other countries, and themselves are working from a very precarious position. Well, it turns out I have realized in part during this stay here that whether for support staff or for early to mid-level academics, working conditions in South Africa, where I come from, are actually far better than in Germany. So in a spirit of solidarity, I've decided to use the platform given to me by this prestigious and very honoring Ela Bhatt Visiting Professorship to reflect on the challenge of academic precarity and try and draw ideas from other labor struggles to inspire the Genossen that are trying to fight this. I use the word Genossen on purpose. I know that in Germany people are a little bit more awkward about using that term, but since part of what I'm going to talk about is the need to draw on slightly more radical struggle repertoires, I feel maybe we can start with changing a few of the words we use. So before continuing, let me apologize for being a bit cheeky. But one dimension of Germany's really important international labor solidarity work revolves around the tireless promotion, for example by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, of its corporatist model of social relations, which you could summarize as follows: let there be large unions, let there be large employers, collective bargaining, and all will be well. The problem, of course, is that such conditions are not in place in many countries, especially in the global south. In South Africa, where the labor movement, and COSATU in particular, embraced very warmly in the 1990s the German and Northern European social compacting approach as a road to heaven, it has had very mixed results. And I would even say it has had very poor results when it comes to the subject of today's discussion, namely the protection and mobilization of precarious workers. Similarly, Lindner, who's written a very nice article in French that my colleagues here shared with me, remarks that the German corporatist culture, with its focus on negotiation with employers over worker mobilization, partly explains the disappointing results of anti-precarity movements in German universities. So what is to be done? Well, let me start by discussing a little bit the conditions, the sorry conditions of work for most people in German universities. Now, for an audience like you, I don't want to be too tedious and go into too much detail telling you what you already know, but I do think it's important to establish a few things, right? A few basic facts on which we can build our understanding. I should start by saying that I've chosen the term university workers on purpose to emphasize that whatever the external or internal perception of the job may be, Alex here has written very eloquently about the myth of meritocracy. Academics and administrators running universities are workers. Their jobs do straddle varied skill levels and a myriad functions, Some mid-career academics brush with glory and publish in leading international journals, sometimes managing to establish a very prestigious reputation. But they are nonetheless independent relationships with one, and often, I've realized, several universities, through short-term contracts typically tied to a professorial unit and increasingly to time-bound third-party funds. Now, the same applies to many administrators or support staff, something that actually puzzles me, because it is even more unusual than precarious working conditions for academics in other countries in the world. So, according to the data I found, in 2017, out of 385,000 teaching and research staff in German universities, you had 12% with permanent positions, which overwhelmingly are for professors. 50% were on fixed-term contracts, half of which were limited to a year, and this is the famous befristet contracts. This is the so-called Mittelbau, right? the middle of the university staff, which includes a variety of different kinds of contracts, but some of them, and I know several people in those contracts, so I'll try and pronounce this well, Lehrkraft für besondere Aufgabe, are basically teaching-intensive contracts that make it very difficult to develop a publication track record and therefore to hope to reach a permanent position. The remaining 38% are precarious teaching assistants or Privatdozent, whose legal contracts, I've realized, straddle a range of very precarious forms, which are very often not framed as labor contracts, but they're framed as self-employed contracts, which is, as I'll return to, a very common trend globally. And one must add, of course, to this category, a category that's often not included, which is the student assistants, who are in some universities recognized as part of the university staff, for example in Berlin universities, I'll go back to that. But in Kassel, as many of you know, they are classified interestingly or paid out of the same budget as tables and cameras, Sachmittel, means of production. Unsurprisingly, they're not very happy about that. Now I want to make two important points here. The first one is that the real German specificity here lies in having this gigantic Mittelbau under precarious employment conditions. That is, from the different places where I looked, completely unique to Germany, right? And one of the, if anybody was wondering about it, one of the good signs that many of these people in the Mittelbau are not entirely happy with those conditions is that German academics are incredibly prone to emigration. Many of them do emigrate, and more than 50% of interviewed social science academics, interviewed in a 2010 survey, expressed that they were keen to try and emigrate to find more secure employment. The second point is that the growing reliance on the last two types of contracts I mentioned is a global phenomenon, right? In other words, I'll go back to this, but a combined growth in student numbers, therefore in teaching requirements, together with not an expansion of core staff to provide the teaching, but a variety of precarious forms of staff. And that has led, in places as varied as France, South Africa, the UK, the US, to a range of struggles from this group of, let's say, teaching assistants or Privatdozent, which have often, which I think are actually very interesting struggles. I'll go back to this to connect to. Now, with the rise of short-term contracts tied to particular projects of varying durations and the introduction, this one is a mouthful for me, of the 2007 Wissenschaftszeitvertragsgesetz that establishes that workers, that workers ought to be given permanent contracts if they fulfill 6 consecutive befristet contracts, we've seen a further precarization of academic work. Because indeed, those 6 contracts are not seen by employers as the sign that somebody has definitely, through securing 6 contracts, earned the right to get a permanent contract. They're seen as a risk, right? As some of you know very well. So to avoid this, working conditions have been further precarized with the introduction of what appears to be a systemic strategy of offering part-time contracts. Right? Again, I don't think I need to dwell on that, do I? Those contracts are, especially for support staff, insufficient very often to meet their daily living costs. They are therefore expected to find other work, or have to, rather than expected to. This is clearly not the problem of the universities. Sometimes in different cities, requiring travel costs, the stress inherent in multiple jobs, tiredness, and of course, strain on families. Besides administrators, it's my impression that it's probably mid-career female academics that are most negatively affected by the system of structural precarity. My anecdotal evidence from two close colleagues offers a similar and rather depressing picture. Both are dedicated teachers and researchers, have an impressive, at least from a quality point of view, which is what should matter, but not necessarily what does matter, track record of publications, and are engaged in innovative, absorbing research projects. One of them, because of the nature of a contract, has to travel to several cities to make a full-time salary. Both also have a child and are seriously considering abandoning the academic career as they are pessimistic about their chances of getting a full-time job. In particular, they are unsure about their ability to cross-subsidize a substantial amount of time required to prepare an habilitation. The latter being a condition, as you know, but not a guarantee for finding a permanent academic post. As I said, 12%, right, of all the counted academic staff have permanent positions. Now, the fact, of course, that both are also prominent figures in the struggle against academic precarity, I imagine, does not make them feel too confident about their chances of success either, but I'll return to that. Now, this points to the gender bias against women inherent in this German academic system, where formal hierarchies and gender roles overlap to create a daunting set of structural conditions hindering the success of female academics. This is not to say there are no female professors. Their number, according to what I found, has increased from 15% in 2005 to 23% in 2015. It's an increase. One could also argue that it's grossly inadequate, but it's definitely an increase. Now, as you know, there has been three main movements that have emerged to contest the situation in the past 10 to 15 years. And in a second, I'll go back to why these movements have emerged in this particular time. Unterbau in Frankfurt, which also very much struggles against the weeding out of critical content from university curricula. And Gavis, I won't try and pronounce the full name of that just now, which aggregates about 30 local struggles, including the Unbefristet movement in Kassel. And TV Stud, which basically reflects the struggle by Berlin teaching assistants to update their 2001 collective agreement. Now, I think there's a similar problem in Kassel, I was told a few days ago. But just to give you an interesting piece of labor evidence, right? Because there's been no upgrading of this 2001 collective agreement and the related hourly payments that teaching assistants receive in Berlin, their real salaries, it's the nominal salary minus inflation, with inflation happening over 18 years, has decreased by 30%, right? So they've had an erosion of 30% of their real income. That does seem like a valid reason for mobilizing to me. Now, how is this pervasive precarity that I just described, right, which again to an external observer is a paradox, it's very astonishing. How is it justified? How can we understand it from the point of view of the university system? Well, there was a very easy way for me to answer that question, which is that in response to the growing demands from the movements I just discussed, German university chancellors issued in September, so 3 months ago, an explanation, which has come to be known as the Bayreuther Erklärung, because it was drafted at the University of Bayreuth, a city that seems to be conducive to a certain amount of grandiloquence. Now, chancellors, as you probably know, are not the heads of universities in Germany, but they're administrative managers. I find it interesting that these were the ones that offered such a widespread response to the struggle and not the rectors or presidents, even though this was subsequently endorsed by university management. And what a response it is. 1.5 pages, which, far from conceding that the demands emanating from groups of university workers around the country may derive from a genuine experience of precarity and reflect legitimate aspirations, the Erklärung slaps them in the face by asserting that such time-bound contracts are in fact necessary in order for university to perform their role towards the rest of society. Now bear with my German. Das Modell befristeter Qualifizierungsphasen in den unterschiedlichen Bildungsformaten der Universitäten ist eine unverzichtbare Voraussetzung dafür, dass dieses gesellschaftliche Ziel weiterhin erreicht werden kann. They even go further in the document, adding that not only is it in favor of the whole of society, but that short-term contracts are needed to ensure that future generations, the students, can access this marvelous system of incremental training, presumably by avoiding that large groups of parasitic academics like us clog the system. Die Befristung stellt sicher, dass Qualifizierungschancen auch den jeweils nachfolgenden Studierendengenerationen eröffnet werden können. I've forgotten about the double infinitive in German. The strategy is clear and, in my view, unapologetically confrontational. Chancellors argue that the demands of protesting university workers stem to harm German society as a whole, as well as younger generations who may aspire to benefit from an academic career. Displaying a remarkable degree of coherence, if not empathy, they go on to ask for the expansion in that Bayreuther Erklärung of short-term contracts in order to prop up the system. Now, as far as I can tell, that's not much of a negotiating position. This blanket rejection of demands for greater job security, in particular for the Mittelbau, rests on one central argument. Universities, they argue, are places of learning, and the development of academics into butterfly professors requires constant mobility. Hence, in case this was not clear yet, the professors explain that die von gewerkschaftlicher Seite erhobene politische Forderung, gute Arbeit heißt entfristete Arbeit, DGB, kann deshalb in dieser Form für die Qualifizierung des wissenschaftlichen Nachwuchses, nice word, nicht gelten. So in other words, for those who don't speak German, that the demand by trade unions that good work should mean work that doesn't imply short-term or fixed-term contracts cannot apply, because this is basically a training system, right? Which is astonishing, because if you stop for a second, that could apply to just about any job, really, right? Now, as I said, the document is a mere page and a half long. And while I concur with the Engavis document that I read, that its very existence is a sign that universities feel pressured to respond to the demands articulated by academic networks and student networks, its arrogant tone and its infantilizing stance, claiming effectively that about 100,000 mid-career professionals are being trained rather than actually working, teaching and doing research, right? Which is effectively what the document says, suggests, in my opinion, that the employers do not take the workers seriously at all. Indeed, they deny the very fact that these demands reflect a labor dispute. Right? This is evacuated. The response issued by Engavis, in my view, hits the nail on the head, ridiculing many of the claims of the Erklärung and labeling it a Bankrotterklärung, or a moral bankruptcy. But it's important to emphasize that the position of chancellors reflects the significant power imbalance in this emerging struggle. With much of the staff in universities in Germany employed in precarious contracts and a union membership rate of about 5% across the country, this in a country where collective bargaining requires much bigger numbers for workers' voice to be heard, management doesn't feel particularly threatened. This is interesting insofar as the justification they provide for the current employment system is devoid of any sophisticated attempt at spin, something I've become very used to in South Africa, right? They appear in the naked light of a labor scholar as employers eager to maintain a status quo that ensures a great deal of discretionary power over employees through the co-optation of a narrow but significant layer of what could be called a labor aristocracy. In this case, the professors and, of course, the central administration of universities. The latter groups are presumed to be fully trained, not requiring the sort of permanent discipline and compulsion imposed by short-term contracts and the need to raise funding for one's own survival. Now, it should be obvious by this point that no position on the way in which to organize labor and the universities has any claim to being correct in the absolute. Outcomes, as we know, are determined by conflicts, which can be open, as is hopefully going to become more the case, or dormant, as was the case until recently. Now, universities are of course eager to claim a moral high ground, as is evident in their attempt to pit the demands for permanent contracts against, on the one hand, society as a whole, and on the other hand, against students. And in so doing, I think they combine a specifically German tradition with a more global trend associated with the rise of neoliberalism. So I'd like to discuss both of these now. First, the German trends, and then how, in my view, what's happening is also reflecting more global trends. Now let me start with the German idiosyncrasy that I became aware through a very interesting discussion with a key informant, which we could call the Hannak principle. I'm sure you've heard of Professor Hanak, an important physicist working in 1930s Berlin, he argued vigorously and successfully in favor of organizing academic life around all-powerful professors in order to allow them to advance research in the most effective manner. In other words, the guiding principle was allegedly excellence. Now, I have much respect for my peers and my senior peers, but I'm skeptical of the fact that all professors have such genius that all academic work should systematically only be organized around them. I do think, along with many of the documents I read by many of the movements here, that disciplinary or departmental organization also has a value, including the value of democratic control over the organization of academic work. But more importantly even, it's also clear that academic research, however brilliant, does not always constitute the best preparation for a managerial career, which is effectively what German professors have become. Geniuses expected to manage large groups of academics and support staff, as well as oversee countless funding applications, right? Now, that's not to say that some of them don't do it very well, of course, right? But such an organizational principle is, as ever, the result of particular choices and power relations. Now, in relation to how this impacts on relationships, I just want to say it's clear that what we can consider as slack or lazy behavior is in large part subjective. And I think anybody who's done research on labor relations will have come across this. It depends on the expectations of the one who wields power in the employment relationship and whose opinion and voice is typically disproportionately dominant vis-à-vis that of the employees. In developing countries and in South Africa, for example, I find very illustrative examples of this, because there you have radically diverging perspectives very frequently. You can interview employees who are convinced they are very brutally exploited, while their very employers are arguing very strongly that they're a bunch of lazy do-nothings, you know? Very, very, very common, right? These kind of things, you know? And I think it's useful to bear this in mind, because what makes such research relevant for German academia is that it captures different perspectives on work from radically unequal actors, which is effectively what the system has created, in a manner that doesn't exist, for example, to the same degree in the Wolfsburg-Volkswagen factory, right? Where for a range of reasons, the relationships are a lot less unequal. Now, I was very surprised in that discussion with my key informant to hear that permanent positions did exist for the Mittelbau, although not abundantly, until about 35 years ago when they were discontinued. When I asked why this was done, the response was unambiguous, because professors felt that their researchers were not working hard enough. Now, bearing in mind the asymmetric, almost pyramidal power structures of German academia, this is hardly surprising. Professors expect an extremely high level of responsiveness to any of their demands, and are usually not prepared to entertain any form of reluctance, however justified it may be. Remember the story of the photocopy that we opened with. Now, in other words, in order to ensure that other academics work as they should, it is important, from a professor's perspective, to keep them on a tight leash, with a suitable amount of uncertainty to ensure they are constantly striving to please their employer. Now, such an approach to disciplining labor can be understood again through the prism of research in developing countries, where the development of capitalism has seen brutal forms of economic coercion replace no less brutal forms of extra-economic coercion, or violence. Now, while there is undoubtedly a difference in degree, and the forestry workers that I studied in South Africa for my PhD undoubtedly have a more precarious life than university workers in Germany, the use of economic coercion can be traced to the same well-known argument. And by economic coercion, I mean the threat of being left on the market, right? The threat that if you don't manage to secure a contract, you won't be able to survive, right? You won't be able to develop your life, right? It's more subtle than beating somebody up, but in capitalism, it's very effective. Now, the same argument, namely that market relations offer greater compulsion than non-market relations, or put more simply, the idea that entrepreneurs work harder than workers. Now, it's an idea we were discussing in class this morning, right, which explains the attempt at renaming a lot of new jobs, for example in the gig economy, transforming workers into entrepreneurs. And it happens to have an intellectual history. somebody called Knight, who in the 1920s wrote a book about risk and uncertainty, which is very much one of the foundational pillars of neoliberalism. Now the problem is that without even needing to resort to any kind of evidence, the argument that precarious contracts would make people work harder and better can be rejected theoretically using Knight's, because he says they have greater incentives derived from the possibility of higher profits or the threat of bankruptcy as opposed to wages. However, he spends a fair amount of time discussing a crucial and often overlooked proviso. He says that this mechanism does not apply to subcontracting relations. In such relations, Knight explains, the contractor harbors no hope of a greater payment if he or she performs better than expected. Right? If you're teaching a course, if you do a great course or a crap course, it's not going to have an impact on how much you earn, to bring it down to what we're talking about, since the price of the transaction is agreed a priori. Not only that, but there's often a tendency for the lowest price to be determinant in obtaining the contract. As a result, Knight adds, coining a deliciously neoclassical phrase, the preferred ways for contractors to increase profits, contractors who employ workers, rather than to pursue product or process innovations, is to manage the wage rent. I love that particular image. To squeeze wages, right? Now, there's also no available evidence, to be very blunt here, that short-term university contracts lead to better performance. Indeed, in other large European countries, such as France or the UK, while varying degrees of academic precarity have been creeping in following budget cuts and the rise of the shift to third-party funding, there is no comparable absence of stable employment opportunities for ABP, anyone but professors. In these academic systems, as well as in many others, it is accepted that the development of an academic career requires some stability, and the prize of, or the possibility of promotion, is viewed as sufficient incentive to ensure that people actually work. While we should treat available university rankings with extreme skepticism and caution, in part because they tend to disadvantage universities, like in Germany or in France, where there was no push for inter-university differentiation, as opposed to the US, for example, in other words, an attempt to have an equal university system. One cannot fail to notice that the only German university in the 2019 academic ranking of world universities, also known as the Shanghai ranking, is Heidelberg, ranked 47 out of 50. Now, in order to understand the current situation and the emergence of a counter-movement, I want to add two more elements of context before discussing the strategies and finishing. Firstly, the number of students in German higher education has increased dramatically in the past 20 years, rising from 1.8 million in 2001 to 2.7 million in 2015-16. So going from 34 to 58% of the relevant age cohort. This has been accompanied by an expansion in academic staff numbers from 157,000 in 2000 to 236,000 in 2014, and I think we're now reaching almost 300. But most of these new positions have been financed through third-party research funding, right? Not core funding and not teaching funding. That is to say that the Mittelbau has been growing in a precarious way in terms of its employment conditions, while representing a structural resource to allow the extension of teaching activities to a rising number of students, which is, of course, the core business of the university. Similarly, in the absence of any significant permanent job creation to meet the demands of rising student numbers, as well as the growth of ad hoc research projects, the number of temporary lower-level academic staff and of support staff has skyrocketed, all of whom are in short-term precarious positions. Secondly, and I think crucially, to understand the rise of the movement, we need to remember that these precarious short-term contracts have become a lot more dangerous in the last 20 years in Germany. As we know, precarity has been growing since the early 2000s with the neoliberal reforms initiated, of course, by the SPD, the Hartz reforms 1 to 4 that have loosened dramatically the German safety net. In other words, being in non-permanent university employment is substantially more precarious than was the case before these reforms were introduced. The risk of falling through the net, right, of losing your apartment, and much more than that, is much greater than it was before. And the degree of competition for scarce places is also greater given the growth in academic precarious positions. And I should emphasize here how much respect I have for activists in movements such as Unbefristet. Because they're not only fighting a very important battle, but they're doing so from a position where they may not actually be able to directly benefit from the fruits of their struggle. But also because the road might be long, as we'll discuss now, before something concrete happens. But also because it is likely that their very activism could be indirectly punished when they apply for new befristet or unbefristet positions. In other words, it's not unlikely in such a system that there might be some levels of undermining, right, of some of the loudest voices. What is to be done about this? Well, I just want to reflect, sort of like in the last section, on the suitability of German corporatism to respond to this, both to the neoliberal onslaught and to its particular manifestation in German universities. Through my research on the restructuring of labor relations in South Africa, I've become convinced that such corporatist models are not fit for the purpose of responding to the changes that have affected labor relations in the past 40 years. The reason is rather straightforward. Labour market restructuring has everywhere taken the form of vertical disintegration, with direct employment by elite firms reduced aggressively by any means necessary, and the related rise in the number of small, medium and micro firms, including of course the ultimate micro firm, the self-employed workers, such as the person delivering meals on a bicycle in Berlin. Now, while the degree to which this restructuring has led to workers becoming precarious varies depending on the protection afforded by national institutions, and we've just heard that in Germany that protection has been declining, trade unions have overall not responded to that challenge. They have typically let their members be shifted to smaller employers while being fully aware that the smaller an employer, the harder it is to unionize workers. Unsurprisingly, union density rates have been falling from South Africa to France, the US, and I realized, to an extent that I did not realize, Germany. So I found one database that put real, which I realized it means excluding retired workers who remain union members, isn't that sweet? So real union density in 2011 at 18%. The other, from the OECD Stats survey data, so you could say it's biased because it's the OECD, reported the following densities for 2004, 2009 and 2015 respectively: 16.8, 11.9 and 9.0%. 9% of all staff in Germany members of union. That was a bit of a discovery for me. Now, falling union densities may signal the declining ability of unions to organize workers, but not necessarily the failure of collective bargaining, as agreements negotiated by strong unions and large employers can at times be extended to all firms, right? And in fact, in Germany, about 60% of workers are still covered by collective bargaining agreements. So my point is not that collective bargaining as a whole is unfit for purpose. For example, a nationwide collective bargaining agreement with good conditions for universities would be a sensational instrument to end precarity. But achieving such an outcome is utterly unthinkable under conditions where labour is so weak. The unionization rate in German universities, as I said, is about 5%. Hence, the logic of trade unionism that expects improvements to flow from negotiations ought to change in the face of the shrinking of union bases. It takes little effort to see that focusing on negotiations will not increase membership. Conversely, the strength of the negotiating positions flows directly from the union's representativity. Now, how thin must the Colossus's feet be before it realizes it's about to collapse is somehow what I wonder when I look at this. Leaving unions aside to focus on what they are supposed, or who they are supposed to represent, the workers, it is clear that restructuring combined with union apathy has left them exposed to extremely asymmetric, as economists like to say, relations with employers. And I think what I was discussing in relation to the Bayreuther Erklärung has hopefully made this clear. The so-called rise of atypical work, which is becoming increasingly typical already, appears to be going on unabated, aided by technology in the form, for instance, of the gig economy, which, by the way, is going soon and already starting to affect academic labor very, very directly. Workers with low and high levels of skill are all concerned, and increasingly, I would say, as they're pushed on the sides, ignored by unions. But they are fighting, as the German academic workers are and university workers are, to form organizations of their own. In some cases, unions themselves have been able to respond better. It has sometimes entailed pushing for top-level regulation. So typically, and this is what I've seen in South Africa, you've seen something like COSATU, the confederation, completely unable to respond through unionization to the precarization of work, but able to understand that it had a responsibility to pressure the government to try and improve the situation of workers through either increasing the minimum wage, right, which has a positive impact on all workers, or trying to limit cases of very extreme forms of subcontracting and very precarious work. Now, to finish, I just want to draw on this and in 2 minutes think about the strategy forward. It seems to me that the mobilizations have started having a very clear effect, which is that political parties, especially center-left and left political parties, are understanding that, of course, university lecturers represent potentially a very useful electoral base. I mean, I should have mentioned that another thing that is quite specific to Germany, coming from France and living in South Africa, and having studied in England, is just how little politicization there is of students and academics compared to other countries. Right? I mean, it is something that I think is different and quite meaningful. Now, the fact that the movements are now on the radar of a lot of political parties is clearly leading to a growing amount of pressure put on university presidents to try and increase the availability of permanent contracts. Now, this could be seen as a solution, right? Because obviously a lot of the most influential leaders of the movements against precarity belong to this middle bough, right? Of associate professors and senior lecturers and so on. But there's a problem with that, right? Which is that if what is settled for is simply a marginal or substantial increase in permanent contracts and improvement at the top, it's basically going to mean an expansion of this labor aristocracy that I was talking about at the expense of the other struggles, right? And part of what I'm finding really fascinating in what I've read about Engavis, for example, is the attempt to both try and build links with unions, including trying to build bridges between unions that sometimes were opposing one another, but also the idea of including a range of struggles, the struggles of student assistance, the struggles in favor of a more pluralist teaching in the universities, and really more broadly trying to fight precarity from the university, not necessarily as socialism in one university, if you could call it like this, but actually as a broader political and economic and social issue. And I am personally thinking that it's not unlikely, because the worst can never be excluded, that a strategy will be developed to try and lower the heat on this movement by offering and increasing, going back basically to what existed 35 years ago or before that, so increasing the availability of such contracts in an attempt at calming or muting some of the more radical dimensions of the movement. I happen to think that, and to feel that, in view of the fact that this precarization that's affecting German universities is very much one case among many of what's happening across the world and across the rest of the economy. And the fact that there's the beginnings of a mobilization that is really starting to build itself across a range of different categories, what is actually an important strategy to develop is one that is a much more confrontational strategy. Sorry to say that. In other words, based on what I was trying to highlight earlier, namely the fact that the university management clearly doesn't feel threatened by the movement. And based on the fact that a lot of the existing movements have only had very minor effects. I mean, as far as I understand, for example, right, there are very few links beyond a few networks, right, between the different groups of university workers in Germany, or between the different groups of students, right? I think the possibility of envisaging alliances and actions that would actually disrupt the ways in which universities are functioning are actually one way of increasing the pressure and increasing the possibility of enhancing recruitment. Now, this is obviously a dangerous strategy, right? Because increasing the pressure, right? I mean, and this is very much, I mean, listen, in South Africa, right? The overthrow of apartheid started from a position of incredible brutality, right? And incredibly strongly justified structural violence and structural inequality. If people had just been waiting to be given the right to organize and to negotiate, there would still be apartheid today. I've got no doubts about it, right? In other words, such a system will either be adjusted at the margin, right? But it's clearly there in my view, or the strategy that's clearly, you know, one strategy that I would learn from a South African example is that disruption is required. Now, I've had conversations with many of you around this. Disruption is clearly not something that people are used to doing here, right? I was pointing this out earlier. I was running into the lift and I said, can you hold the lift? And one of you was looking for the button. And I said, I would have just thrown my leg to stop. No, but just, you know, I think there's a cultural thing where I'm not saying it's fixed, I'm not saying it's in the blood. But there is, you know, go to a demonstration in Paris and you will see what I mean. And I think there's a moment, if you have a small movement, it can actually cause a lot more damage than you think. And also, as it starts placing itself on the radar of a range of other people, this is something that, and this is a very strong lesson, maybe I'll finish here, from South Africa. What I found is that people tend to join movements and to feel like they want to be mobilized if they feel hope. If they feel hope and if they feel an increase in self-esteem from joining those movements, right? And this is something that is, I think, you know, there's, I mean, so I was interviewing somebody from the students, right? The group of student protests. And what were the two demands that are made? One is to be acknowledged that students who work in the university are workers and not Sachmittel, right? And the second one is politely demanding that that there is some inflation level improvement year on year of the hourly remuneration, right? I mean, if you've done any economics, you know that if you don't have an adjustment based on inflation, you're effectively losing real income, right? And I was reflecting, you know, this is a very tame demand, right? This is a demand that is clearly formulated in a context where people are used to these corporate structures where you make tame demands, but you're very strong. So the tame demands are made more or less entirely by the people from whom you made them. If the IG Metall, I'm sure in Wolfsburg, says we want plus 5%, they might get plus 4.8, but they will get what they want, right? In a situation where this is such a situation of minority, I would just say it's time to make bigger demands. Let me stop here, and I look forward to hearing your voice.
Thanks for the moment. After the international perspective, now the local perspective, although globally informed, I guess.
Thank you so much. It was such a rich presentation. I will struggle to do justice to it. There would be so much to comment on. So just a few reflections. First of all, obviously what is specific about this topic is when I talk about it, I'm the object as well as the subject of this research. As a labor scholar, I've written about precarious work in academia and precarious work in academia in Germany. As someone employed with a German university, I'm on a contract that is going to expire in 3 years, and I have no idea what will happen afterwards, and no idea how I am going to put food on the table, to talk in drastic terms here. I want to highlight two things. One is the importance of international solidarity, and two, if I still have time, Christian told me I have 10 minutes, how is the status quo in Germany justified? You discussed some of these issues already. So what I brought to this table is the continuation of the debate that you quoted from. There was the Bayreuther Erklärung, the Declaration of Chancellors, and then there was a reaction from academic activists, labor activists in academia, but there was also a statement from the university president from the state of Hessen. I just want to quote from this statement that was published after the other two statements had been made. It's from November of this year. So this conference of university presidents in the state of Hessen says, the practice of creating termed positions, or we support the practice of creating termed positions for scientific qualification. This practice of creating termed positions is a standard practice, not just in Germany, but all over the world. So we're on to the topic of spin. And I thank you so much for your contribution, because you pointed out very, very clearly that this is not a standard practice all over the world, but is specific to Germany. And what is important about this statement is that what is happening rhetorically is what happening all the time. That is, there's an intentional conflation of the fact that people do PhDs, and the practices around doing PhDs are fairly comparable internationally, and that there is a specific German regime requiring postdoctoral scholars to write a second thesis to qualify to become full professors. And this system also entails that people, once they have completed their second thesis, are in the job market again. That's an important detail. It's not like in the tenure track system in the US that you meet your tenure requirements and then you have a permanent position and you're safe. It's the opposite. You finish, you finally have your qualification to be a full professor, and you're on the job market again. And what is also important to know, just the number to illustrate the challenge of then obtaining a permanent position. In the year of 2014, which is the latest numbers that I have at least, for every person who became a full professor the first time in their life, or were appointed to a full professorship, 5 people completed their second thesis. So the numbers simply don't add up. A lot of people are simply then relegated to the sidelines. And this is why your talk is so important, because you really call this bluff. This system is specific, but it is defended by saying, this is standard practice, we do it everywhere. This also resonates with my experience of talking to colleagues internationally. Whenever I talk about my personal working conditions with colleagues from all over the world, and I've talked to people from South Africa, from the US, from Britain, from Turkey, from Hong Kong, the reaction is pretty much the same everywhere. It's absolute astonishment that a middle-aged colleague with a half-decent track record of publications and some international experience is really worried about his job prospects in the future and faces the possibility, at least, of becoming unemployed after his contract ends. Another aspect of that story is also that international colleagues I meet at this university very often aren't entirely clear about how this system works. Basically are astonished to learn how difficult it is to proceed in this system. So I think it's important to tell this story and to tell it internationally.